The morning they came to record the sale, a hawk sat on the courthouse weather vane and did not move. Alara Voss stood in the gravel below, a folder of papers pressed flat against her coat, and watched the bird the way she watched most things, patient still, as if she had all the time in the world and knew something was about to happen that no one else would see coming. The county clerk came to the door and called her name twice before she answered. Inside, the air smelled of ink and old wood and the particular staleness of rooms where important things have been made small by paperwork. She signed her name in 5 places. The clerk slid the deed across the counter without looking at her, and what she received, in exchange for $411 in delinquent tax obligations assumed and $11 in recording fees, was 72 acres of land that the county had been trying to unload for 3 years without a single taker. 3 springs earlier, the search for those acres had begun without her knowing it. Alara Voss was 24 years old that first autumn in Harlan County, Missouri, and she had arrived with a wagon, a mule, a cast-iron skillet, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has been told all their life what they cannot do and has, through repetition, become immune to it. She had no family in the county, no history, no name that opened a single door. What she had was $300 sewn into the lining of a coat that had belonged to her mother, a set of hands that had been hard since she was 9 years old, and a clear-eyed understanding of one simple fact. Land you own is land no one can take from beneath you. Everything else can be argued with. Land, properly held, does not argue. It only asks to be worked. The town of Calla, Missouri, 4 blocks of storefronts, a grain elevator, a feed merchant, a Methodist church, and a reputation for knowing its own business to the last decimal, received Alara Voss the way a cold creek receives a thrown stone. There was a splash and a brief disruption, and then the creek closed over the place and went on running exactly as it had before. The women at the dry goods counter looked at her hands when she came in to buy flour. The men at the feed merchant spoke to a point slightly past her shoulder. The proprietor of the only rooming house in town, a man named Creel with a face like a worried boot, told her that the room was $4 a month in advance and added, with a glance at her coat, that he hoped she'd thought this through, a young woman setting up on her own. She paid the $4 without a word and asked if the room faced east. It did, and she took it, and she spent the first 2 weeks in Cale walking. She walked the roads in every direction until she had a picture in her mind of what land was doing what and why, and what it might be made to do differently. It was on one of those walks, following a road that became a track, that became a deer trail that she found the 72 acres. They were a disgrace by any accounting, county-wide. The topmost field was a thicket of nettle and burdock, so dense it had to be pushed through like water. Below that, a hillside of shale and stunted scrub oak offered nothing but the most vigorous kind of ugliness. The creek that cut the lower edge of the property had sunk so low in its banks that you could walk across it in August without wetting your boots above the ankle. And at the back of the property, hidden under 15 years of cattail and sedge and the slow, patient accumulation of mud, there was a structure, stone fitted, old, very old, maybe older than the county. A dam, or what had been one, buried now under the debris of everything that had grown up around it in the years since anyone had paid it any attention. Alara Voss stood at the edge of the hidden structure with her boots in 6 inches of mud and looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the wet ground around it. Then she looked at the hillside above. She was, at that moment, doing arithmetic, not the kind taught in a schoolroom, but the older kind, the arithmetic of what a thing could be if you understood what it was doing and simply helped it do it more. She was not a farmer yet, not in any way the county would have recognized. But she had grown up watching her mother make something from the kind of nothing that would have broken a lesser woman, and she had learned to see past what a thing looked like to what it might quietly be. She did not tell anyone what she had seen. She went back to her rooming house, room that faced east, and she thought about it for a week. Then she went to the county courthouse and asked about the parcel, and was told it had been tax delinquent for 3 years. and she asked what it would cost to clear the taxes and record a deed, and the clerk told her, and she went away and thought for another week. And then she came back with $422 in an envelope, and she bought the 72 acres that no one in Kayla, Missouri had wanted at any price. News of the purchase reached the feed merchant's counter by afternoon. The verdict of Kayla was swift, was thorough, and was unanimous. A young woman alone, no backing, no family, no one to call on, had paid real money for the worst ground in the county. Creel, the rooming house proprietor, shook his head and said he hoped she'd left herself enough to eat on. The grain merchant said, "A thing's only worth what someone will give for it," and no one had given a cent for that ground in 3 years, which told you everything. A farmer named Dowd, who worked the next parcel east, said, loudly enough to be widely repeated, that she'd have done better to sleep in the street and save the recording fee. This observation was considered very clever by most of Kala and was repeated, without attribution, many times over the following months. Ilara Voss heard most of it. She was not deaf, and Kala was not large. She heard it, and she went on with her work. She found the elder neighbor on her 3rd day of clearing. His name was Pavel Ondrik, and he was 67 years old and had come from Bohemia in 1858 and had farmed the 40 acres east of the county road for 31 years with a methodical patience that had made him, if not prosperous, then deeply, rootedly solvent. He came to the property line one morning in October and stood watching her work the nettle with a long-handled slasher, and he watched for a while without speaking, and then he said, in the accent that had never fully left him, "You know what is underneath all this?" She said she had some notion. He nodded slowly, as if that was the correct answer. He said, "The land remembers what it was. You only have to ask it politely and give it time. The worst-looking ground," he said, "is often the ground that has been resting the longest. Rest is not the same as death." She stopped working and looked at him. She said she would be grateful for anything he could tell her about the lower end of the property, about the stone structure. His eyes went careful and interested. He said he had heard his own neighbor, the man who had farmed the parcel before the family died out and the taxes went unpaid, mention a mill dam original to the first settlement of the county. He said whoever had built it had understood the watershed. He said the problem with the land was not the land. The problem was what 30 years of unmanaged growth had done to the drainage. That conversation was worth more than the $411 she had paid for the parcel. Ilara did not say so to Pavel Ondrak at the time, but she thought it, and she held it. By November, she had a one-room structure on the property log, low, tight enough to keep wind out, with a clay and stone chimney that smoked on wet days but held its draft on all the others. She had also, by November, spent $11.60 acquiring 4 breeding sows and a boar from a farm sale 2 counties west. The farmer's widow was selling everything and had priced the hogs to be gone, and Ilara had cash in hand on a cold morning when no one else had come yet, and she had loaded the pigs into a borrowed wagon and brought them home without telling anyone in Kala what she had paid or where she had been. The hogs she turned onto the nettle thickets. This was the decision that confirmed in the eyes of Kala, Missouri, that Ilara Voss was either simple or broken-hearted by events no one knew about. Hogs, it was explained to her, in the feed merchants, in front of 3 other customers, by a man who had kept 20 head for 15 years. Do not clear land. Hogs eat. They root. They make a mess. What she would have, he said, by spring, was 72 acres of mud and 4 fat pigs, and no crop and no pasture, and nothing to show for a winter's work. He said this with the particular patience men reserve for explaining things to people they have already decided cannot understand them. Ilara thanked him for his concern and bought her feed. What hogs do in nettle thickets on hillside ground with no drainage is this: they eat the green and they root the root. And where the root has held the surface crust together against water for 30 years, they break it open, and the water, which has been sliding off uselessly all that time, begins instead to soak in. And then they move on and eat the next thing, and then the next. They are, if you know how to use them, the most efficient land-clearing instrument yet devised. Pavel Ondrak knew this and had hinted at it. Alara Voss had reasoned her way to it independently. The Hogs did not know or care about the theory. They simply did what Hogs do, and by February, the lower Nettle field was open, ground-churned and dark and beginning, under the freeze-thaw of a Missouri winter, to break down towards something that might, by May, be worth calling soil. She named the boar Erasmus. The sows she let her nearest neighbor's daughter name, a girl of 8 named Cora, who had taken to watching the Hogs through the fence with an absorption that suggested she and Erasmus had reached some private understanding. The girl named the sows Agnes, Myrtle, Perpetua, and Sue. Cora thereafter referred to the entire enterprise as Agnes and Them, which Alara privately thought was as good a name for a hog operation as any she had heard. She did not say this to Cora. She paid the girl in apples when apples were available, and in hard candy when they were not, and the arrangement was satisfactory to everyone involved. Winter was the arithmetic. She had 4 sows and a boar, purchased at $11.60, and she had fed them through to March at a total cost in grain and scrap of $9.40, for a running total of $21. She had first litters coming in April. If the timing she had calculated from the breeding dates held, a sow of good stock could be counted on for 8 to 10 piglets per litter. 4 sows times 8 conservatively was 32 piglets. 32 piglets, grown to market weight by October, at prevailing prices. She did the arithmetic in the dark, in the one-room house, by the sound of the fire. She did it several times to make sure she had not made a mistake. She had not. The number that came out each time was enough to make her sit very still for a moment before she went on. She told no one. It was, as Pavel Ondrak would have understood, a coal banked low under ash. Some things you keep until they are ready to be shown, and a plan is not yet real until it has come through the ground. April came warm and then cold, and then warm again, and Agnes delivered 11, which was beyond expectation. Myrtle and Perpetua each delivered 9. Sue, who was younger and smaller, delivered 7. 36 piglets, in total alive and bellowing, which was 4 more than the conservative arithmetic had promised. Cora heard the news and came to the fence, and stood looking at the chaos of small warm bodies in the straw, with an expression of pure solemn amazement. And then she looked at Alara and said, "Agnes did very well." "She did," Alara agreed. All of them did. May was when the Hogs reached the dam. They had been working the lower property through April, the original 5 adults and their offspring contained by a movable fence. Alara shifted in sections, a technique she had reasoned out through the winter and which Pavel Ondrak confirmed was sound when she described it to him. By the 3rd week of May, the fence had advanced to the marshy lower ground at the edge of the cattail stand, and the larger hogs, Erasmus first, then Agnes and Myrtle behind him, began to root in the mud at the edge of the standing water. They found the first stone in the dam on a Tuesday morning. Alara was watching. She had been watching that corner of the property every day, because she understood that what happened there was the whole hinge of everything she had planned. The stone was granite, dressed on one face, old mortar still adhering to one edge. She pulled on her boots and went in and found another beside it, and another below, and spent the better part of that day on her hands and knees in the mud alongside Erasmus, which was, she was aware, a scene that would have confirmed every opinion in Kaya about her sanity had anyone been present to witness it. But no one was, except Cora, who stood at the fence without comment and handed Alara tools when asked. And this was, Alara thought, exactly the right behavior. The dam was 6 feet at its highest, 30 feet across, dry-fitted granite beneath the mortared upper courses, sound as the day it had been built. When she had cleared enough of the mud to understand its shape and its purpose, she went home and sat by the fire for a long time. Then she went to Pavel Ondrak's door and knocked and told him what she had found. He sat down in his kitchen chair and was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I thought it was there. I hoped it was there. You understand what this means for the water," she said. She understood exactly what it meant for the water. What it meant was this. The creek that crossed the lower edge of her property had once been ponded by that dam into a reservoir of between 4 and 6 acres. She estimated from the lay of the land and the old silt levels, deep enough to hold water through a dry summer. That reservoir had been the engine that made the original farm on this land viable. 30 years of neglect had silted it, had let the dam fall into the cattail marsh, had shrunk the water table on the whole hillside property above. Restore the dam, clear the siltation, and you did not merely restore a pond. You lifted the water table of the entire property. What was scrub and shale on the hillside above might, in 2 or 3 years, become something that would hold grass. She spent June and July repairing the dam with Pavel Ondrak's help, and with mortared stone she split herself from the shale outcrop on the hillside, which turned out to be good building material and wanted only to be properly understood. By August, a pond was forming behind the dam. By the time it reached full pool in September, following a week of heavy rain, it covered 3.5 acres and held 12 feet of water at the center. Ilara stood at the edge of it on a warm September evening, with her boots off and her feet in the shallows, and ducks came from wherever ducks had been waiting for precisely this pond to exist, and landed on the water with the unhurried confidence of animals who know they have found the right place. This seemed to her like a good sign, and she allowed herself to think so. She went back to the feed merchants in September to sell the first run of market hogs, 19 head, grown from the April litters, selected for size and rate of gain, and culled from the slower growers she intended to carry through to a second cycle. The merchant who took them on commission was a man named Ferris from Hannibal, who came through on a buying circuit 4 times a year and had the face and manner of someone who had been surprised very rarely and intended to keep the streak going. He walked through Ilara's pens without a word for a long time. Then he looked at the hogs, and then at her, and then back at the hogs. He said, "Where did you breed these?" She told him. He said, "From Crampton's sale." Those were good animals. "And you've got 36 young coming behind these?" She said she had 36 piglets, and she was keeping 12 back for breeding and selling the remaining 24 at market weight the following spring. Ferris was quiet for another moment. Then he said he would give her a fair price, and she said she knew what fair looked like, and she would be grateful if he remembered that, and he did. And the 19 hogs brought $112, which was, when she subtracted the costs of the winter and spring and summer, a net return of $91 on the first cycle. She walked back up the road from town with that figure in her pocket and did not hurry, but there was a quality to her step that Pavel Ondrak, watching from his fence line, recognized. He said nothing. He simply lifted his hand, and she lifted hers in return, and that was sufficient. By the following spring, Kala had begun to look at the Voss parcel differently, the way people look at something they dismissed too quickly and are in the process of revising their opinion of without quite admitting that revision to themselves. The pond was visible from the road. There was a very respectable hog operation behind a solid fence. There was cleared ground where the Nettle had been, and that ground was showing, in the second spring, a green that it had no business showing on land that had been considered worthless. Creel, the rooming house proprietor, took a long look driving past and said nothing at all, which in his case was a form of admission. And then the summer of the following year came, and it was not an ordinary summer. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The creek system in Harlan County dropped by 2/3 in 6 weeks. The wells in Kale fell. The Dowd farm to the east of the county road, which had 30 head of beef cattle and pasture that had looked, in May, like it would carry them easily to fall, turned brown in July and was cracking clay by August. Dowd sold off 20 head at the worst possible price. Distressed stock, everyone knew it, the buyers knew it, the price reflected it, and the loss set him back in a way he would not recover from for 2 years. It was the same story on 4 other farms in the county. It was not the same story on the Voss parcel. The reservoir behind the dam held. 12 feet of water does not evaporate in 6 weeks, not even in an August like that one. The creek feeding it ran low but did not stop, because the restored water table on the hillside above was still releasing slowly what it had absorbed through the wet years. The hogs. She had 68 animals now, between the breeding stock and the current growing cohort, had water. The garden she had put in on the lower cleared field had water. She was not comfortable, not by any measure, but she was not failing. And in that summer, in Harlan County, Missouri, not failing looked a great deal like abundance. Hunger changes a town. So does the sight of someone prospering while you suffer. The combination changes it faster. By the third week of August, 2 families from the East Road had asked Alara if they might water their stock at her pond. She said yes. She did not make an accounting of it or ask for anything in return, and they both understood the significance of that, and neither of them forgot it. Dowd came on a Wednesday evening alone and stood at the fence and asked after the pond, and she told him about the dam and the water table, and he listened in the particular way of a man who has spent a year and a half being certain he was right about something and is now, in the silence between someone else's sentences, experiencing the adjustment. He did not say he had been wrong. He said, "I didn't think that ground could do this." She said she had suspected it might, and that was why she had bought it, and there was no unkindness in the way she said it, which was, she knew, its own kind of reply. Being right is its own kind of reply. It was in that same August that a man named Halcott arrived in Calla. He was from St. Louis, he said, representing a livestock purchasing concern, and he was acquiring good breeding stock throughout the region, and he had heard about the Voss operation, and he wished to make an offer for the entire breeding herd. All 23 animals, at a price he described as generous. The price was $61. He named it with the smooth confidence of a man who believes he is dealing with someone who does not know what $61 means relative to what 23 breeding animals represent. Alara looked at him for a moment. She said she would think about it. He said the offer was time-sensitive. She asked him when he had gotten the count. He looked at her. He said, "What?" She said, 23? "I haven't told anyone the count of my breeding herd." "How did you know it was 23? Halkett had a smooth, practiced face, but something moved through it then that was not smooth. He said he must have counted when he walked the lane. She said he had not walked the lane. She had met him at the road. He collected himself and said the price was his best offer, and she would not do better. And a woman managing a place of this size alone was, he said carefully, always in a position of some vulnerability, and she should consider that. Pavel Ondrak had come down to the fence line to see who the man in the good coat was, and he stood there now listening, and Alara could feel him there the way you feel a reliable wall. She turned to Halkett and she said she thought she understood what he was suggesting, and she thought he should understand something in return. She had 68 hogs, not 23, and her breeding stock was not for sale, and she would be grateful if he would go back to wherever he had come from and think about whether his next conversation with a person he judged to be alone ought to begin with a lie about the count. Halkett looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Pavel Ondrak. Then he got back in his wagon and drove toward Calla, and Alara watched him go, and the hawk, or a hawk, she could not be certain it was the same one, swung in a slow circle over the pond once and moved on. Pavel Ondrak said, "You handled that well." She said she hoped so. He said, "The worst-looking ground does not know who was right about it. It only knows what it was asked to do." The second full harvest that October was this: 41 hogs to market at a price Ferris negotiated with a third buyer who had come, specifically because Ferris had spoken about the quality of the animals, and the total came to $263. There was also a market garden that had produced through the dry summer because of the irrigating she had done from the pond, and she had sold surplus vegetables in Calla through August and September because there was a surplus and people needed it, and she had priced things at what they were worth and not at what desperation would have borne. And that was a different number from what she could have charged, and she knew it, and she set the price she set deliberately, and Calla knew it too. The knowledge of it was the kind that moves through a community quietly and reshapes things without announcing itself. She took in $319 that October, net of all costs. She was 26 years old. She paid Pavel Ondrak $400 for the eastern 40 acres when he told her in November that he was thinking of selling and going to live with his son in St. Kerrs, Joseph, and that he would rather sell to her than to anyone else because the land deserved to be in the hands of someone who understood what it could do. He asked if 400 was fair. She said it was more than fair and she would pay it. He said the thing he had said once before. Then, as a kind of completion, the land remembers what it was. You only have to ask it politely. She shook his hand on a cold morning in November in the doorway of his house, and he left for St. Tree. Joseph 3 weeks later, and she stood in his empty kitchen one afternoon in December, looking at the view his east-facing window had of the pond she had made from a mud-silted ruin, and she thought about what the word politely meant when applied to land, and she thought it meant patience and stubbornness, and the willingness to see a thing for what it actually was, rather than what everyone had agreed to call it. She now held 112 acres, the original 72 plus the 40 she had bought from Pavel, and the pond, and the dam, and the hogs, and cleared ground that was coming green in a way that would support pasture by the following year, and she had, in the bank in Hannibal, more money than she had ever owned in her life. It was not a fortune, it was a foundation. Those are not the same thing, but a foundation is worth more because you can build on it. Calla, Missouri revised its verdict slowly because towns do not admit they have been wrong. They simply begin treating you as if they had always thought well of you and trusting that no one will point out the discrepancy. The feed merchant began to speak to a point roughly at her face, which was an improvement. Dowd's wife sent a jar of preserves in September, and Alara sent back a smoked ham in October. And this was the unspoken language of frontier women acknowledging that the land is hard and no one in it ought to be making it harder, and the exchange meant more than either of them said aloud about it. Creel, the rooming house proprietor, passed her on the road one morning and said, with the pained look of a man performing an operation on himself, "I think you've done well out there." She said she was grateful for the room that faced east because it had helped her think. He nodded and went on, and she went on, and that was as close as Calla came to an apology, and she did not require it to be closer. Cora, who was 9 now, came to the fence every day that school and her mother permitted, and had developed opinions about the breeding merit of individual sows that Alara was finding increasingly useful to think alongside. The girl had an eye. Alara did not say this to Cora directly because Cora was 9 and did not need to be told things she already knew, but she let the girl help with the selection decisions in the October culling, and Cora's reasoning was sound, and the animals they chose together were, the following spring, exactly as correct as they had looked in October. This was not coincidence. This was the eye operating. The spring brought Ferris back, and with him a man from Kansas City, a hotel man, he said, who was provisioning a dining room and wanted a reliable supply of quality pork, and would pay a contract price for it, which was a different thing from the spot market, and meant planning ahead and producing consistently. And she sat with both men at her table and listened, and asked several questions that caused the hotel man to look at her twice, and in the end, she signed a 2-year supply agreement at a price that guaranteed her, if she met the volume, $180 per year above costs. She was 27 years old, and she had a signed supply contract in the drawer. Of the table she had built herself in a house she had built herself on land that the county of Harlan, Missouri, had been unable to give away, and outside the window, the pond lay flat and silver in the April light, and the ducks that had come the first year had come back and brought others, because that is what water does in a dry country. It calls to itself. She went to Pavel Ondrak's fence line that afternoon. It was her fence line now, but she still thought of it as his, and probably always would. And she looked at the whole of it, the cleared hillside, showing its first real grass, the dark soil of the lower field, the pond, the hogs in their rotational pens. The small stone house with its crooked chimney that she had built with her own hands in the first November. She looked at all of it for a long time, the way she had looked at the hawk on the courthouse weather vane on the morning she signed the deed, patient and still, certain that something was happening that most people would not see until later. Then she went inside and put a pot of water on the fire, and sat down and did the arithmetic one more time, for the pleasure of watching the number come out right. It did. It always did, when you were patient enough to do the work correctly. The worst-looking ground in Harlan County, Missouri had not known it was the worst-looking ground. It had only known what it was. An old watershed with a sound stone dam buried under 30 years of inattention, a hillside that wanted drainage, a water table waiting to be lifted back to where it had always been before people stopped asking the land what it remembered. Alara Voss had asked. She had asked with her hands and her boots and her hogs and her mortar and her long careful attention to the things that everyone else had decided were not worth paying attention to. And the land had answered in the way land always answers, which is not with words, and not quickly, but without any ambiguity whatsoever, green and deep and abundant, in the one place everyone in town had agreed that nothing could grow. The hawk came back in the spring. She saw it most mornings over the pond. She did not know if it was the same hawk. She suspected it was. Either way, she had stopped being surprised by the idea that a creature with good judgment recognizes a good place when it finds one. So, it turned out, did the rest of Cala, Missouri, though they took considerably longer about it.